20th Century Fox decided to make a movie that combined their two different X-Men franchises. They filled in some plot holes and created some new ones. On this episode of Moving Panels, we discuss X-Men: Days of Future Past. Welcome to Moving Panels, the podcast where we discuss movies and TV shows based on, inspired by, and adapted from the world of comic books. I'm your host, Laramy Wells, and joining me on today's episode is Deanna Thomas. How are you, Deanna?
I'm good. How are you, man?
I am awesome. Talking about X-Men: Days of Future Past, probably one of the better of the X-Men franchises.
Yes, if we're talking about X-Men exclusively, if we were talking about X-Men including all the Wolverine ones, I think Logan would probably be in the best.
Oh, yes. But if we're talking talking about the X-Men storyline, which I think Logan is separated from.
Yes.
So before we get into talking about the movie, you actually requested to do this movie. So tell everybody, what's your relationship with this movie?
I didn't really get into X-Men until I saw this one. And then I went back and saw the older ones and was super let down. But it definitely got me more into the story of the X-Men and Logan's involvement with it and some of the X-Men past Wolverine, like Kitty Pryde and things like that.
It's kind of funny you say Logan's involvement in it, because that was really just done for this movie, which we'll get into. This is the 7th movie in the Fox's X-Men franchise. The original trilogy was 2000's X-Men, 2003 X2, and the one we would love to forget, 2006's X-Men: The Last Stand. Then they kind of went off a little bit, and since Wolverine, as you're talking about, was such a big success, we got 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine, another stinker. Then we got... Then we got 2013's The Wolverine, not horrible. Then they decided to reboot, quote-unquote, the X-Men movies in 2011 with X-Men First Class. So that's the 6 movies that led up to this movie. This was released in May of 2014, and it essentially was Fox's attempt to do what DC usually does in the comic books with their Crisis. It was to kind of fix a lot of the mistakes and to fill in a lot of the potholes, which I will admit they did fix some, but at the same time, and we'll talk about this in the episode, they created others. And I find it funny that it's like, oh, you haven't been watching these movies since the beginning, like you said. With this movie, it was like, oh, don't worry, we'll just show you flashbacks of all the important parts of all of these previous movies.
Yes, all of them.
Well, you know, when I went back and thought about it, I actually, though, do not think there are any flashbacks from the Wolverine movies. I think they're only from the original trilogy and First Class. I honestly think anything that you would think is from like X-Men Origins was actually from X2, since it kind of tells the same story.
That's true, because I was just thinking of one of the flashbacks that was in X2 with Wolverine and Stryker. You're right.
Yeah. Now, this is a fun movie to talk to here on Moving Panels, because Days of Future Past is actually a storyline from the comic books. It was Uncanny X-Men numbers 141 and 142 back in 1981. So it was only a 2-issue storyline, but it actually was a storyline from the comics. It was written by Chris Claremont, who actually makes a cameo in this movie. He's one of the congressmen that is hearing Trask speak at the beginning of the movie. Lin Wen, who is also one of the co-creators of many of the characters, including Wolverine, also plays one of the congressmen. So I like the tie-in there. They've done it before. They did it in the animated series. They both the Fox 90s one, that's awesome. They did it in the Wolverine and the X-Men series, that was okay. And they even kind of poked fun at this storyline in the little kiddie superhero squad show that came on, I think, like Cartoon Network or something.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump into it. Let's break down the characters. And as most people would probably think, we would talk about Wolverine first, but we're not. We're going to talk about Kitty Pryde first. So Kitty Pryde, returning Ellen Page from the original trilogy. She returns here. And I wanted to point her out because The character debuted in the comics in Uncanny X-Men number 129 back in January of 1980. If you remember, I said the Days of Future Past storyline took place in 81, so just a year later. And the storyline was a way to build Kitty Pryde's character. She is actually the main character in the story. She's the one who travels back through time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that they use her just to send him back in time instead of making her a main character, which shows you that they know that Wolverine is one of the favorites of the franchise rather than Ellen Page's character.
Yeah, but as you said, they bring her in, and she's the one that actually sends Logan back in time, which as soon as she does that, I immediately go, wait, that's not Kitty Pryde's power. Kitty Pryde's supposed to be able to just walk through walls. Like, when did she develop time-traveling powers?
Right. They created it to make the movie easier to make.
Yeah. So, well, it prevented them from having to introduce a new character, because in the comic, Kitty is sent back by Rachel Summers, who is actually the daughter of Cyclops and Jean Grey. And I guess they just, to avoid having to explain all of that, they just said, okay, we're going to use a character you already know. We're going to give her this ability. And I guess we're just to accept that in the years that have passed since the last time we saw her in this, she developed this new ability, and just accept it. Move on. It's a movie.
Yeah. Another weird thing, like Laramy and I, one of my close friends are pop collectors, and they have the Kitty Pryde pop, and it comes with a little purple dragon, and I have no idea where that comes from. And that's another random thing about Kitty Pryde.
That's Lockheed, isn't it? Isn't that the dragon's name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Which doesn't he then become like he ends up going with another character and becomes like part of that Excalibur, the British version of the X-Men.
Yes.
Yes.
So it's just interesting that we just kind of got the 20th Century Fox version of Kitty Pryde to make the movies.
Well, I'm not crying over what would have been a very horribly cartoonish CGI dragon in these movies.
100%. Yeah, it would have been awful.
Yeah, so I'm totally fine with them excluding Lockheed from that story. All right, so moving on, everybody wants to hear us talk about Logan, Wolverine, played by Hugh Jackman. I mentioned this was the 7th X-Men movie, and it's the 7th one for him. He's the only person to appear in all 7 of these movies. Mm-hmm. Even with his, 10-second cameo in First Class. He technically appeared in First Class.
Yeah, I think these past 2, because since Logan was the last one, they were the only 2 he wasn't in.
Yeah. So, of course, best character in the franchise, hands down. I don't think that's really up for debate. And I do think that this movie really took his character, since he was kind of standing out among all the characters, and they said, okay, well, let's let him stand up, and instead of just being a X-Men, let's make him kind of a leader of the X-Men, kind of the one who is able to hold the X-Men together, which is very uncharacteristic of Wolverine, but it really was what Hugh Jackman was kind of developing in this character.
That's very true, because he, even with his cameo in First Class, he definitely was coming off as a loner, and then they give him this opportunity, and he's like, I'll do it.
Yeah. And it's funny, again, we talk about Kitty Pryde being the main character. They replace her with Wolverine in this one, because in the storyline in the comics, he's actually killed. He's killed by one of the Sentinels. The Sentinel blasts him to where it pretty much disintegrates him. Of course, his adamantium skeleton remains, so it just falls in a heap, all of his metal bones and whatnot. The character Warpath, one of the smaller kind of unspoken, I don't think he speaks, characters from the future, actually gets kind of what was Wolverine's death. If you remember, he leaps towards the Sentinel while it blasts, and he's disintegrated.
Yeah.
And so kind of gets the same death there. The only other fun little tidbit with Wolverine in this movie is that when he's sent back in time and he wakes up, the people that he then confronts, where you're guessing Logan has since been working with some sort of gang or whatnot, they kept calling him Jimmy, which I actually liked because it was established in Origin that his name isn't Logan, that it's actually James. And so at this point, because this does happen before Origins, he still knows his name is James. And then, of course, Origins happens, and he loses his memory at the end of that movie. And so that's where we get to him calling himself Logan after that.
Right.
And then the whole movie is centered around Peter Dinklage's character of Bolivar Trask. I believe that's how you pronounce his first name, because I don't think it's said an awful lot in the movie.
Bolivar. Yeah.
Now, this is interesting because in X-Men The Last Stand, that horrible movie, Trask is actually in it. He's only referred to as Trask, but he's played by Bill Duke. Now, if you don't know who Bill Duke is, look him up. He's a great actor. He was in Predator back in the 80s. Fine actor. Looks absolutely nothing like Peter Dinklage. So this is kind of that same thing that the Batman movies did with having Harvey Dent played by Billy D. Williams, and then 2 movies later, Harvey Dent is being played by Tommy Lee Jones. So we've got the same thing here. We got Bill Duke, big guy, African-American, and then he's played by Peter Dinklage.
Now, is Bolivar Trask in The Last Stand super old? Because then he would probably be in his 70s or 80s.
Well, he's not that old, because Bill Duke, I mean, I would say maybe he's pushing 60, but see, that's another thing, and we're going to get into this. The time travel thing, it creates a lot more plot holes. There's a few other characters we'll talk about that their ages don't make sense.
Yeah.
So the other kind of main character of this storyline is Mystique. And just like I think they brought Wolverine in because he was the more popular character, I think they wanted this to also center around Mystique because Jennifer Lawrence was at the highest point of her career at this time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she was off. I don't know how close this was to winning an Oscar, but she had already been nominated. I mean, she was nominated for Winter's Bone almost right off the bat when she started in her career. She was doing the Hunger Games at this time, and so she's at the height of her career. Speaking of Oscars, this movie is loaded with people associated with the Oscars. There are, on top of Jennifer Lawrence, there are 7 other Academy Award nominees, and a couple of them have won in this movie. You got Halle Berry, Hugh Jackman, Michael Fassbender, Michael Lerner. He plays a senator. You may not be familiar with him, but he has been nominated for an Oscar. Ian McClellan, of course, Ellen Page, who we mentioned earlier, and then even Anna Paquin. She's got her little cameo at the end, but she is not only an Oscar nominee, she is an Oscar winner. But
I mean, Halle Berry wasn't really put in the movie that much either, surprisingly.
True. Yeah, she barely speaks, which I'm going to say it. I'm not a huge Halle Berry fan, so I was okay with that.
Yeah, she didn't really need to be a huge part of that movie.
No, she's not necessary. But again, Mystique, she's a big villain in the comics. In this storyline in the comics, she's in it, but she kind of takes over what a group of mutants do. She's part of what's known as the Brotherhood, which consists of Toad, and I think the Blob is one of them in this in the storyline in the comics. Of course, we've already seen the Toad in the original X-Men. We saw the Blob in X-Men Origins. So we'd seen a lot of those characters, and then I think some of the other ones we had never been introduced to. So same thing, you don't want to bring in too many new characters, especially for big parts. So I think this is, again, let's just focus it on Mystique because she's been popular. Jennifer Lawrence is, hot in her career, and just go from there. And that pretty much takes care of the entire story is centered around these people.
Yeah, for sure. If we were to add anyone, it might be I'm losing his name, Magneto's character, but he's definitely not set too much in the middle of it. Yeah,
Professor X and Magneto, they're important to this story, but it's really more like a I don't know what word I'm looking for, but it's almost like they're in this story because they just have to be.
Because they're a part of it at the start, yeah.
Yeah, and especially Professor X, because in the comic book version of Days of Future Past, Professor X is actually killed with it's not Trask in the comics, it's actually Senator Kelly that the assassination of. But Professor X is actually killed along with him. And so Professor X is not in this. So he doesn't exist in the future when Kitty is sent back. So, and of course,
well, he wasn't supposed to. He wasn't supposed to now either. But
yeah,
in the series of plot holes. But
yeah, so that we'll get into probably that in more detail when we talk about some of those plot holes. But yeah, because the last time we saw Professor X in the, I guess you would say, continuity of this story was X-Men Last Stand, and he was Thanos dusted, but by Jean Grey.
Yeah, and all of a sudden he's alive again.
Yeah. So, and then same thing with Magneto. Again, he seems unnecessary. The love triangle that they try to kind of force in there that was established from First Class between Mystique, Raven, and Professor X, they kind of try to force it, I think, a little too hard in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't think... I like that they brought Mystique off of, like, choosing between the two, kind of how it was in First Class, and she's kind of, like, taking on her own story. But yeah, the love triangle's too much.
Yeah. Well, now, I will say this, though. Having Magneto in the movie is probably the only way we got one of the best new characters out of this movie, and that is Peter Maximoff, a.k.a. Quicksilver.
I agree. I think he was probably the best part of the movie.
Hands down. So, in the comics, he's supposed to be Magneto's son. They do kind of joke about that and imply that it might be true in the movies. After Quicksilver rescues Magneto from prison, he finds out that he's got the magnetic powers, and he goes, my mom knew a guy with the same powers.
Yeah, they definitely nod at that, because Magneto automatically goes, oh shit.
And they even allude to it later in the movie where Magneto's giving his big speech and they show Peter sitting at home watching it, and you see his mom in the background, and the mom kind of has a look on her face that could be interpreted as, I recognize that guy. So they do play with it. Of course, that also lends to, in that scene, he's got a little girl sitting in his lap, which you imply to be the sister. And if you know the comic books, you know that he has a sister that's also Magneto's kid, which is Wanda, or Scarlet Witch. However, they're supposed to be twins in terms of the comic book.
Right, which is in the Avengers.
Yes. And that was a big thing, and we won't get into all that detail, but...
Isn't that why they don't actually refer to Peter Maximoff as Quicksilver? Because of, it was a rights issue between Marvel and Fox?
Yeah, I think that was part of it. Although, to be honest, do they refer to him as Quicksilver in the Avengers movie either? I don't think either one of them is.
You're right. We just all assume.
But then
I don't think they do.
There's also the fact that in this movie he's Peter Maximoff, whereas in the comics he's Pedro Maximoff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
in the Avengers movies, because Pietro saves Hawkeye, they make it the son's middle name, and you actually see it. So that is interesting.
Yeah, so I'm sure that has to do with a lot of the legality that allowed him to be in two different franchises. Now, Fox doesn't acknowledge Wanda or Scarlet Witch. There actually is a deleted scene. If you have the Blu-ray or the DVD, there's a deleted scene that does prove the little girl is not Wanda, because the mom says something to the little girl about, why don't you go upstairs and bother your sister? And so we do know there's another sister in the house, and maybe that's to then imply that that's Wanda. But again, it's not there. But going back to Peter, to Quicksilver, like you said, probably the best character in this movie, at least being introduced to us. And the effects they do for when he uses his speed power are some of the best effects that I've seen in a superhero movie.
Absolutely. I mean, I know in some movies you might think it was a waste of time for them to do the slow-mo scene where he's like knocking food out people's faces and like moving the bullets and stuff, but that was golden. That was
It was
great.
great. Yeah, it was great. And then having the music go along with it where he puts the headphones in, and it's wonderful. And I absolutely love those. But then what doesn't make sense to me is he's the only reason that they rescue Magneto. He is the only reason they get out of that facility. And then what do? They tell him to stay home while they take care of the rest.
Right. Wouldn't he have been useful with
I'm sure he would have been very
maybe?
useful, yeah. And of course that may have been, you got to keep the story going. It's almost they made him almost too quote unquote powerful that it would have been, well, he would make this too easy, so
right, just walk around and just run really quick and get all the metal out of the Sentinels, and then it's over.
Yeah. All right. And we're going to talk about new characters. We'll just mention briefly because they really don't serve any purpose other than to be fodder for the Sentinels. But they do introduce X-Men that are from the comics. They are actually called the Free Mutants in the comic books, and that's Blink, which is the person who does the little teleports. Warpath, which I mentioned earlier, is the one that gets killed by the Sentinel by the blast. He's Native American looking. You got Bishop, who's the technology guy who they don't make it extremely clear. It almost looks like he gets powered up from the other characters. They weren't real clear on how his power works in this movie. And then you got Sunspot, which was the Human Torch looking character. They're from the comics. They're in this movie, although they've really served no purpose, like I said, other than cannon fodder for the Sentinels. And speaking of newer X-Men, this is more of a trivia because he's not named. He doesn't have anything in this movie, but I thought it was a fun little trivia, and that's Nate Gray. Nate Gray is a character from the comics, and he is the scavenger we see at the very beginning, and that's significant because after Wolverine returns to the future, or goes back to the future, if you will, the mutant he sees come out of the room across the hall from him is also Nate Gray, and that's something I think some people don't notice. And so I just think it's a fun little trivia fact to know that the first person you see in 2023 is the same guy both times.
Yeah, it's interesting how they'll put those little tidbits in there for more comic book fans to find, but then still just have gaping plot holes.
And of course, that brings us to the actual moving panels, the parts of the story that either came straight from the comics or were altered from the comics. And that, of course, begins with the 2023 dystopian future. In this movie, it appears to be the entire world. It's not quite stated. But in the comic books, it's clear that the Sentinels have only taken over North America, the United States and Canada. They also, in the movie, they're running from the Sentinels, whereas in the comic books, they've already been captured. The Sentinels aren't really out to kill them. It's capture and contain, and they're in concentration camps. And so it's more of the Great Escape in the comic books. They're just trying to fix that or whatnot. So that's a change. It's still kind of holding the same idea. And of course, we want more of an action element than we did really the drama, and so I'm okay with that change.
Yeah, I think it made it, because since they did touch on actual concentration camps in First Class with Magneto's origin, I think they may have wanted to stray away from that a bit as well.
Yeah, and
I meant First Class.
Yeah, and building on kind of more changing to fit more of the movie framework. The Sentinels themselves in the comic book, they're just the regular Sentinels, just the giant, policing robots. They don't have these advanced adaptive abilities that they have in the movie. They don't have where they were created based off of Mystique's DNA. They're just the plain old Sentinels. But again, I'm okay with that. It made for more action scenes.
Yeah, definitely made it more interesting and probably more believable as robots who could defeat mutants.
Yeah.
I think.
The time frame is also a change, but it's a change to fit the needs. It wouldn't make sense. The comic books, the future is 2013. Well, the movie came out in 2014, so that wouldn't have made sense. And then they jump back to 1980. In the movie, it's 2023, so that way it was in the future, although that's only 3 years from now, if we actually look at it. And they jump all the way back to 1973, so a bigger jump in the movies, which kind of explains, again, why they couldn't have used Kitty as the time traveler, because her character wouldn't have been born in 1973.
Right. Well, because in the movie she was sending his consciousness back. In the comics, you said it was Rachel Summers who sent Kitty back. Was she sending Kitty back that same way, her consciousness?
Yes. So it was still the same. It was still the same time traveling kind of framework where it was sending someone's consciousness back to their body in that time. And so there wouldn't have been a Kitty Pryde in 1973 to send her consciousness back to.
Right.
So again, kind of explains that. I had mentioned earlier also the assassination. In the comic, it's Senator Kelly, but we've already seen him. There was the Brotherhood, which they did tease. There's actually almost a completely random scene where Mystique goes and frees a bunch of mutants from Vietnam. And a lot of those, Toad's one of those, they're characters that you could think would be the Brotherhood, but then you never see them again.
Right. That scene may have, the only thing I think the purpose could have served was maybe to show that, like, what Mystique's mission was. Like, it was to save mutants, and that was it.
Which, of course, is a rehashed mission of Magneto, because that's always been Magneto's.
Right.
And then we've got the Paris Peace Accords that happen in the movie. That's where Mystique, overpowers the Vietnamese or Korean ambassador. And keep in mind, she does not kill him. You almost think she kills him, but if you pay really close attention, you'll actually hear him like gasp for breath right before that scene ends. And so he's still alive, because it's an important part of the story that Trask is supposed to be the first person Mystique kills, which turns Raven into Mystique.
Right. I always thought that, and I must not have been paying close enough attention, because I didn't know if the timeline had already changed because Wolverine had gone back in time, because I always thought, did she kill him though? So I guess just need to pay more attention.
Well, I'll be honest with you. It's something that I don't think they make it very clear, but I just so happened to hit rewind on my TV because I went, did she kill that guy? And so I hit rewind to check, because if so, I was going to go, oh, there's another plot hole we need to talk about. And on my TV, when you hit rewind, it automatically turns on the closed caption. And so it turned on the closed caption, and when they showed that shot, the caption said, deep gasp.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so that's how I was like, okay, so we're supposed to hear him breathing before they cut away to know he's still alive.
Right.
But you were talking about, was the future already changed? Well, in the comic books, when the Paris Peace Accords happened, which is supposed to be the assassination, in the comic book, once Kitty stops the Brotherhood from assassinating Senator Kelly, that's the end of the comic book. Kitty goes back to 2013 and everything has been, or no, actually scratch that. She doesn't go back. Her consciousness goes back, but we stay in 1980 in the comic, and we just have to assume that everything's going to be fixed from that point on. We actually don't get to find out what happened. But I still again, that's where the comic book ended. As soon as they stopped that assassination at the Paris Peace Accords, comic book's over. And yet we've still got like another, hour in this movie.
Right, like we almost haven't even hit the climax of the movie, and but to add more of that action that they want to add into it, they make Magneto the villain again.
Yeah. Now, I will say they do kind of wrap back around to the comics, because the next big storyline that happened with the X-Men, because they messed with time, it came back in the comics, and that's what led to the Age of Apocalypse. And this movie also implies that, if you stay for the the famous superhero post-credit scene. We've got the post-credit scene in Egypt, and all the people are chanting for this guy who's helping build the pyramids. And again, help of closed caption, they're actually chanting on Saba Nur, which is the actual name of the character Apocalypse in the comic books. And we even see the Four Horsemen back on the sand dune. So again, like you talked about earlier, that for the true comic book fans, this was another like, hey, look.
Right, yeah, I remember seeing that, and then oh no, wait, you said the Scarlet Witch tease was like exclusive to DVD. That's to say, sometimes those superhero movies like having one in mid credit and end credit.
Yeah,
but that was different.
Yeah, no, the Scarlet Witch wasn't actually in the movie. That was a deleted scene. But yeah, other than that, there's not an awful lot in this movie that's, we've talked about the characters, and we've talked about the parts that have a connection to the comic. The rest of the movie, and like we said, pretty much the rest of the movie from the Peace Cords on is all just for the movie. So we can talk about those a little bit more, but what I really want to get into, as we've alluded all episode, are the plot holes. Now, there's some they fixed, and I'll give them that. There are some that they worked out. There are, I think, just as many that they created.
Could definitely agree with that.
And of course,
they are notorious.
Yeah, and you've already talked about this one, and it's one that I think hits you almost right off the bat when you see Patrick Stewart in the future, and you just go, wait, how is he alive?
Yeah, it's just like at first you're like, oh, okay, Professor X, and then you think back, you're like, wait.
And the other thing about Professor X is that confused me was, I'm going, wait, should he have a wheelchair? Should he not have a wheelchair? Because when you go back to The Last Stand, X-Men The Last Stand, which again we talked about, he's dusted in that one, and you think he's dead. And I know there is that scene, again, another post-credit scene that indicate his consciousness went into another person, but then that wouldn't be Patrick Stewart anymore. So, but the wheelchair, because at the beginning of The Last Stand, we see where Professor X and Magneto go to visit Jean Grey as a child, and Professor X is walking.
Right. Well, and there's also one where I believe this is in X-Men Origins, when they're rescuing all the X-Men, all the mutants from Stryker's little thing, like right before you see the terrible Wade Wilson.
Yep.
And walking Patrick Stewart comes out and is like, follow me.
Yeah, he
like,
walks out of the X-Wing. Yeah. So
right.
it doesn't make sense. Then you start going, but if that's supposed to be the younger version of Professor X, and in these movies the younger version of Professor X is James McAvoy, but James McAvoy is in a wheelchair. It did not make sense.
No.
Then there's plot holes that are fixed and created even around Wolverine. So I really think this movie, to be honest, I think it ignores the horrible X-Men Origins movie. Because if it didn't, this again still doesn't make sense. Because Origins, based off of timeline, Origins happens in 1979. That means Origins would have only happened 6 years later. And we talked about people's ages not matching up. Stryker's age wouldn't match up. He's played by Josh Hellman in this movie, who appears to be 30s And then in X-Men Origin, he's played by Danny Houston, who's clearly in his maybe mid to late 40s, 50 pushing it, but yet it's only supposed to be a 6-year age difference.
Yeah, that wasn't good choice of actor to try to have consistency.
Again, the only thing I can assume is that they're ignoring Origins happened, because we also see in Origins, as we follow Wolverine and Sabretooth throughout the years, we know that they fought in Vietnam. Well, this is 1973 in this movie. Vietnam's going on. So why isn't Wolverine in Vietnam?
Also a good point. And probably something a lot of people didn't realize. So that is true. They probably just ignored Origins.
Yeah. But don't want to talk about only problems. They do fix some plot holes. And one of them is one that I have held on to since X-Men First Class. In X-Men First Class, Professor X and Magneto are recruiting mutants. They walk into a diner. You see Hugh Jackman. He tells them to go away in not so nice words. And in this movie, they at least acknowledge that scene. Now, if people are going, okay, so what was the plot hole? The plot hole is from 2000's X-Men. So, 30 years later, you have a scene where they discover Wolverine. They're looking at his X-ray. They're talking about how old he is and his powers, and he could be older than Professor X. And Professor X says in that movie that he is never encountered this mutant before.
Right, so they didn't account for the story they had already told, just because they wanted to include Wolverine in these prequel movies.
Yes, yeah, because Hugh Jackman had become so famous, they put him in the First Class movie and completely ignored that moment from the original X-Men. But like I said, they at least acknowledged it in this movie, which I appreciated. I also liked that they also had where they kept continuity at the same time lost the continuity. They kept the continuity because in 1973, Wolverine would not have had his adamantium. So when we see him extend his claws and they're bone, brilliant. That's what it's supposed to be. We're good. The problem is that the future Logan, when he extends his claws, which we see when he accidentally stabs Kitty, his claws have adamantium on them. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, in the Wolverine movie, he's had his adamantium stripped.
You're right. So you're talking about the Wolverine.
Yes, the Wolverine. That in the Wolverine, his adamantium is removed from his body. Now,
do we know when that one takes place? Does that take place after?
It would have to take place before.
Right. Very interesting.
So it makes no sense for... So again, the only, you can give them the benefit that they're ignoring the side movies. They're ignoring the Wolverine standalone films. But the fact that you've got Hugh Jackman playing the same character, and they acknowledge in both of those movies the events of the original trilogy, it's clearly the same timeline. And so to then take this movie and ignore those doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
But one other thing with Wolverine, and this was a fun one too, an acknowledgement to the original X-Men. So in the original X-Men, when they go to the Statue of Liberty, they have the scene where they all walk through the metal detector. And of course, when Wolverine walks through it, it goes off and he stabs it. I do like that they made a callback to that when they're entering the White House area and they go through the metal detector and Wolverine passes through it and nothing happens. And it's because he doesn't have his adamantium. So I did like that callback, little inside joke there.
Yes, I agree. I thought that was good. That even though they're not too terribly great at referencing or, connecting the other movies, it was funny to reference that.
Yeah. So another issue I had was with the Magneto story. So he is in jail, he's in prison, and it's for the fact that he, according to them, was involved in the JFK assassination. And they use that, I will say, in a clever way by explaining that's why in conspiracy theories people talk about the bullet curved. Well, it's because Magneto, because he can control metal, so that's why the bullet curved. But then my question is, but the bullet curved and hit JFK. So if Magneto was curving, if he hadn't have curved the bullet, JFK would have actually survived.
Right. I was thinking the same thing. If he was intending on saving him, was it because he got tackled? So like somehow he controlled it into going right. Like, yeah, you have to make some pretty crazy assumptions to make that.
Speaking of crazy assumptions, so then they also imply that he was doing it because JFK was a mutant and he wanted to try to save him.
And then they don't mention it ever again.
No, they that's it. They don't say like what his ability was. They don't say anything more about it. That's it. That was just to give the whole, here's why Magneto is in prison.
Yeah, I don't think that was necessary. I think they could have come up with something else. Because like you said, the curving of the bullet doesn't make sense. And then JFK being a mutant, if you're not going to touch on that anymore, then it doesn't really do anything for the story.
Yeah. I don't know if maybe their intention was to later make another Origins movie and it be JFK. I don't know. But, you know, we talked about this with Professor X and Wolverine. Magneto also, his powers, there's a continuity issue there because in X-Men The Last Stand, he takes the cure.
Right. Or he's someone stabs him with it, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, but yes, but he loses his power. Now, I know people will argue there's the scene at the end where he makes something like slightly move, which then creates a whole nother issue of going, okay, so that means the cure's not a cure, apparently, and it's only going to be temporary, and that creates a whole issue for that movie.
Not the only issue.
Yes, that again, we are talking X-Men The Last Stand. Horrible movie. That's for another episode. But going back to Magneto's powers, I had two problems with what he does in this movie. So the first is after the big fight at the Peace Accords, we see Magneto stitching the wound in the back of his head. Now, it's a cool scene. I get the idea that he's able to control the needle, and so he's controlling the needle to stitch himself up. But what I had a problem with is he's not looking in like a mirror or anything. So how does he know exactly where that needle is going?
He doesn't. I mean, just like you said, it looks cool, and it would probably look super lame if he was like, had a mirror in front of him and was trying to look in the mirror behind him. Mm-hmm. So they were just like, let's make the scene look cool, even though doesn't make sense.
Even if they could have still done it cool. They still could have had maybe mirrors that you would, I guess, assume had metal frames, and so he's got two mirrors floating on each side of him while it's being stitched, and you see the reflection in the mirror. They could have done it in a cool way.
That is true.
But the other thing with his powers is the way he controls the Sentinels. Now, we have the scene with the train, and he brings up some of the train tracks, and he kind of melts down that metal and then inserts it into the Sentinels, and that's supposed to give him control of the Sentinels. Well, that makes sense for him to be able to move the Sentinels, but as he's doing it, you see the Sentinel turn on. That should have nothing to do with their electronics.
Right. He didn't create wiring to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not quite how his powers work, to my knowledge, at least. So, again, fix some issues. We create some issues. There's one other little plot hole that I'm going to fit in just as a sports fan. The baseball stadium that Magneto picks up and puts around the White House is Robert F. Kennedy Stadium. And that's not a problem. Robert F. Kennedy Stadium was there in Washington, D.C. The problem is that in 1973, there was no baseball team. Now, that doesn't stop there from being a stadium. So why is there being no baseball team a plot hole? And again, the Washington Senators had already left. They left in 1971. The Nationals that we have now, they didn't even come up around until 2005. So there is no baseball team playing in Robert F. Kennedy Stadium. Yet when Magneto walks into the stadium, what do we see? We see a guy chalking the baseline.
Why?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
No
one fact. What game is he preparing for?
That's very interesting.
Yeah. My last little thing, and this is right at the end, and it's a little thing, but it again bothered me with the continuity, is we see Wolverine get thrown into the Potomac. We got to know what happens to Wolverine, and so we see him getting pulled out. We think this is where he's captured by Stryker, which is then going to lead to the X-Men origin story, which happens 6 years later. We think that's what's going to happen. However, we find out that Stryker is actually Mystique. Now, again, that's cool and all, but when you really think back to the movie, Mystique, Raven, and Wolverine have never met.
Right, so how would she know to save him?
Yeah. I mean, again...
Or know that Stryker was connected to it somehow.
Exactly. Because I'm like, you would assume that she saw what happened because she was there. And so she saw him getting stabbed by Magneto and launched. And we guess she figures out where he is and finds out where he is. But yeah, the Stryker connection doesn't make sense. How does she know who Stryker is and the connection Stryker has with Wolverine? True, they were both in the peace accords, but that happened so fast, there's no way she could have put two and two together.
Right. And she did meet Stryker when she was on that military base, but he probably didn't even know who Wolverine was at that point.
Yeah, so that's, to me, another plot hole that this creates. And I can't help, I've mentioned this earlier in the episode, time travel, to me, always creates plot holes in storylines when you're dealing with time travel. And there's so many here, so I'm going to knock out a few of these. So first off, they're exposed to the public in 1973. So if the mutants are known by the public in 1973, then that negates every movie that followed.
What do you mean?
Well,
by that?
So if you remember in the first X-Men movie, it's a big deal that we have to identify the mutants. And people are shocked when they see mutants. You know, like when Senator Kelly comes out and is like a blob type person walking on the beach, everybody's amazed. Well, if that happens 30 years after this one, shouldn't people be used to seeing that stuff by this point?
True.
So, and again, I know you can argue, well, that happens technically after the assassination is stopped, which means they're already altering the timeline. And so, okay, that's fine. I get that. And I'm going to get to that even more so in a minute. Because again, the future isn't revealed except for we go back to 2013. So, does this movie create a multiverse? Because if this movie means that none of the previous movies happened, then we have to assume it's a multiverse, which would explain why Professor X is alive, which would explain why Magneto has his full powers again, is that this wasn't the same X-Men from the original storyline.
That would be a I don't want to say easy, but a good answer to those questions to fill those plot holes if a multiverse did exist.
Yeah, but that would also have to be explained without someone like, me or you having to talk it through, because it's not clear in the movie. And my other thing is that it doesn't work for Wolverine, because if the problem is fixed, then Wolverine would never have gone back in order to fix it. And so if Wolverine never goes back, and again, try to follow me on this, if Wolverine never went back, how did Professor X get out of his slump? Because in 2000's X-Men, and X-Men Origins, whichever way you want to go, Professor X isn't depressed. He's opening a school. He's got a school. He's built the X-Men. But this movie implies it's because Wolverine went back in time and fixed it. But if the original movies are part of that timeline, then who fixed Professor X originally? That's
a good point. And that would create a whole other story.
Yeah.
Which would lead to that multiverse theory.
And the same argument in X-Men, or if you want to go X-Men Last Stand, with that scene that I talked about earlier with Magneto and Professor X visiting a young Jean Grey, there's Magneto. Magneto's in X-Men in 2000. Magneto's in X-Men Last Stand in that flashback that's supposed to take place in the 80s. But yet, this movie says Eric, Magneto, is in prison for assassinating the president, and he's going to be there for life. So if Wolverine had not gone back in time to free him from prison with the help of Quicksilver, who got Magneto out of prison?
Right, it would have had to happen for him to be out of prison.
So again, that's the whole thing about time travel movies. It's always, you got to think, if you're going to say it, time's got to work linear. It doesn't make sense unless Magneto goes back. Unless Wolverine goes back. But if now they fixed it, there's no reason for Wolverine to go back. And so who got Professor X out of his slump? Who rescued Magneto? Even if you go to the original timeline, who did it in the first place?
Definitely would be interesting questions to have answered.
Yeah. But another problem is not just with the past, it's also with the future. The movie Logan, which came out after this movie, it takes place in the year 2029. That is 6 years after the quote-unquote future of this movie. So, into this movie, Wolverine has returned to 2023. He's back in the mansion. School is happening. He's a professor. The other X-Men are there. Everything seems happy. Are you telling me that 6 years later, things have gone to crap and we have the movie Logan?
Right, that is true. And that also lends itself to a whole Stryker thing, because you wonder if Mystique, who is Stryker, if he never met Stryker, he wouldn't have gotten adamantium. But in Logan, he has the metal claws. So when did that happen? But still, like you said, Professor X seems completely fine, and then he's absolutely losing his mind. Logan.
They have both aged dramatically in 6 years, if you're going from Days of Future Past to Logan.
Right, because Logan hadn't aged, and so you wonder if what he did going back in time is what caused him to age so quickly.
Yeah, accelerated.
If that'd be the explanation they made.
And see, that's a plot hole just to talk about Logan, is how is Logan aged so much when it's clearly established he's supposed to age slower, and okay, but that's another movie. All right, so anything else you can think of from Days of Future Past you wanted to discuss?
Not that I can think of. I think we hit on all the important stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot here. It was definitely a lot that when I sat down to rewatch it and prepare for this episode, I was writing on my little notepad like crazy, because it just, all this stuff just screams out. Like it's not even stuff that you really have to analyze an awful lot. Like it's just blatant right there in front of you. At least it was for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think anyone familiar with the superheroes and the franchises, even if you're not as familiar with the comics, a lot of the plot hole type things and the character inconsistencies can be fairly obvious.
Yeah, I mean, this is the 7th movie of the X-Men franchise. So you've clearly, even without the comics, you've built a mythology within just these movies. And so, yeah, it's very clear. But let's get to our final decisions here on Moving Panels. We rate the movie based off of the way you would treat a comic book. Do you bag it, stack it, or trade it? So bag it means that it's a keeper. That means you're going to seal it up. You're going to put it in the backer board. You're going to tape it closed so that it preserves it. You're going to put it into your long box up on a shelf. And, you know, you'll get it out when you want to read it, but you're going to make sure that every time it's in pristine condition. Stack it means that you liked it, you enjoyed it, but you're just going to toss it into a pile of others. You'll come back to it from time to time. You might, you know, bring it out when some friends are around going, hey, take a look at this. You know, it may be just for fun, but it's not a huge part of your collection. Trade it means you don't want it to be a part of your collection. You want to get rid of it. You want something better. You want to trade it. That one's pretty easy. So, Deanna, let us know your rating and why. Do you bag it, stack it, or trade it?
I think with this one, I would stack it because I very much enjoy watching the movie. And I think it has, if you took it alone, it is a great story. But I wouldn't call it one of my favorites. There are other, even if we're talking within the same universe, like Logan, I would bag it. It would probably be the only in the X-Men franchise that I bag, but there are, with that one, it's not really one that if some, like if we were talking about it being a comic, if something happened to it, I wouldn't be sad.
Yeah.
So it's because it's not of any superhero movie or movies in general. It's not my absolute favorite, but it's not a terrible movie.
No, I agree. For me, it's also a stack it. As I said at the beginning of the show, it probably is the best X-Men movie up to that point. I'll agree with you. Logan is the best, but I again think that the movies that have the X-Men title, at least other than Origin, I think that this movie ignores the standalone Wolverine movies. And I think that the standalone Wolverine movies are meant to be, you know, one-shots, that they're meant to be outside of this universe, even though they reference them. I think they're taking them away. So, and that's where, again, as you're saying, it really does fall under that stack it. The movie, I enjoy it, but it doesn't excite me. It doesn't have, as much as it tries to bring in more action, it doesn't have that big fight action moments that some of the other movies actually had, as bad as they were. I mean, the fight between the horrible Deadpool in Origins with Sabretooth and Wolverine, it's at least a big grand fight. We don't get that in this movie. It's more dramatic with the big speeches and talking people out of doing things and whatnot. So I agree. This one for me also is a stack it.
Yeah.
All right. Any last words? Anything you want to let any of our listeners know, or anything you want to say to close us out?
I would say that I think one of the best things about this movie is that it basically made The Last Stand not happen. So we can thank it for that.
That is true. That is true. All right. Well, thank you, Deanna. I appreciate you joining me for this. I look forward to discussing something else down the road with you on another episode.
Sounds great.
All right. For Moving Panels, I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.